introducing Nicole Allen. Nicole is, I would say, probably the most well-known OER advocate in the nation, and rightly so. She's going to teach you today a lot about how to advocate. So as many of you are asking, how do we talk to legislators? How do we talk to administration? How do we try to frame the conversation so that they can hear it and feel motivated by it? And there's no one better to teach you that than Nicole.
So while we are waiting slides, I will get us started. So hi, everybody. It's been nice spending the last day with you. I guess the goal of the next hour and 15 minutes is going to be to do a little bit of a crash course in advocacy. And we're going to talk a little bit about what advocacy means. We're going to go through a framework for developing an advocacy plan that includes goal setting. And then there's going to be a worksheet at the end that you can take and work with in your small groups to start coming up with a start of an advocacy plan. And I want to start by telling you a little bit of a story from how I got started as an advocate. So I got involved. Should I take this and can I take this and walk? Yeah, I'm gonna do this.
Do it.
This is awkward. So I got involved in advocating for open educational resources and textbook affordability by accident. I was an undergraduate student frustrated with the high cost of textbooks and high cost of education. And this was back in the mid-2000s. And the Bush administration at the time had proposed a change to federal student aid policy that would have taken $2 billion out of federal financial aid programs to pay for the Bush tax cuts. And I just thought that was wrong. I personally have been very lucky in being able to afford my education, but, I saw students around me, facing barriers just to get a degree. And I got involved working with an organization called the Student PIRGs, Public Interest Research Group. Some of you may have those in your states. And somehow found myself during my junior and senior year coordinating a statewide campaign in the state of Washington, working with students to push back against this legislation. And we had this one congressman in Washington state. He was a moderate Republican, so a swing vote on this big bill. And it all came down to the day before the big vote. And I got a bunch of students out in front of his office. It was pouring rain because Seattle. And we made these signs, like honk for student aid, stop the raid on student aid, call Congressman Reichert, tell him to vote no. And we had to cover the signs in packing tape to prevent them from melting in the rain. So, it was a bunch of us students out there standing out in the rain, yelling, whatever. And then somebody comes out of the congressman's office. And I was like, oh shit, I'm in trouble. We're going to get arrested, whatever. And they asked for the organizer. And I was like, oh, that's me. And what they did is that they took me upstairs to the office, and the congressman stepped off the floor of the US House of Representatives and talked to me for 30 minutes from Washington, D.C. to hear what I had to say. I was a random student who just got a bunch of other students to go stand out in the rain, and I got to speak to one of the people that could have changed the fate of a massive change in federal policy that ended up hurting a lot of students. So the day of the vote, I woke up, I was watching on C-SPAN, and he voted no, or he voted the wrong way. And I was like, oh. So, but when I graduated and went to work for the Student PIRGs full time, the relationship that I had built with this congressman allowed us to get his vote on a couple of additional reforms when Congress flipped in 2006. Vote in favor of some reforms that improved the student loan system at the time. So a couple of lessons. The first is anybody can be an advocate, no matter who you are. And most people who are advocates get into it by accident. And two is that you're not always going to win, but there is value in the process of advocacy, even if you don't achieve your goal the first time, because the relationships you build, the information that you disseminate, the things you learn allow you to be more effective in the future. And now you can see my slides. So perfect. Cool. So I want to tell you one more aside before we get into the conversation. And I would like to correct the record regarding silos. So at the wonderful first meeting that MEC organized five years ago. So first of all, I just want to say how fantastic the MEC region is. You know, I think there's something unique about each of the compacts and the communities that come together. But, you know, looking out and seeing each of you in your state tables and the way that the MEC has worked to build state teams that really do cross those silos of different systems, roles, institutions. I find it, you know, really powerful, and being able to listen in on your conversations over the last day has been really special. And I'm really excited about what's going to come out of this. I started my talk at the last session talking about silos. And I always thought silos were like old and just like how you go to Europe and their castles that are left over. Because they always look like this, right? Like they're about to fall down. So it was a misunderstanding, and I learned things. And now I know more about farming as a city girl. Okay, so and it's been lovely to see the silos breaking down. Okay, we're not going to have that on loop. To start us out, let's talk about what is advocacy. So what is advocacy? What does it mean to you? Somebody.
Trying to convince someone to do something that you want them to do.
That's a very good definition. Excellent. Other things? What else do you think of?
Communication.
Communication is so important. Okay, I know it's like 9. This is the definition that I would give for advocacy. It's taking action to influence change. And advocacy is different from other types of actions that you might take. You know, something like research, that's gathering information and putting it out there in the world. But it isn't directly taking action to influence change. It's not trying to change something that you don't have the power to change. And I think this word influence is really important. Advocacy is about advancing change that you yourself can't make on your own. We live within all sorts of different power structures where there are people who can make decisions that can change things. And our role as advocates is to influence them to change the things that we think are going to make the world better. And that's what advocacy, the process of advocacy is all about. And I think grounding yourself in being an advocate, you know, I think with open educational resources, basically everything we do is some form of advocacy, because at the end of the day, where the change happens with open education is in the classroom. And in order for that change to happen, we need to support faculty to make those decisions. And all of the work that we do is moving toward advocating for faculty to make those changes, supporting them, incentivizing them. So there is, advocacy is in the soul of open education. And what I'm hoping to do here today is give you a more structured framework to think about how you're applying advocacy in your contexts, and to take a look at some of the goals that you developed yesterday and see which ones of them could really benefit from a more structured advocacy plan. So I'm going to introduce a framework that SPARC teaches. So we ran a pilot last year, actually, of an advocacy training program that we may consider continuing this year. And we introduced this framework, and I think it's really helpful for being able to plan to advocate for a goal. And this is the framework. It's 5 parts. It's problem, solution, goal, strategy, tactics. And the idea of this framework is that when you're advocating for something, you don't start with the thing you want to advocate for. You actually start with the problem that you're seeking to solve, and defining what the problem with the world, the way it is. Because in order to change things, you need to establish a reason for change. And then defining a solution to that problem, defining a goal, and then talking about your strategy and tactics. And all of these things need to line up into sort of a coherent system in order to be effective as an advocate. So let's go through these different parts. So when I say problem and solution, I mean taking the time to start and really think about what's wrong in your context. So what are the problems with course materials? What, statistics you have that show that, students are being held back or that there are challenges with, graduation or being able to access materials in remote settings. And think about how your institution or state defines problems in education and how some of those might relate to the realm of work that you're working on. And then once you've identified the problem, articulate the solution to that problem. I think this is really, really important too, because I think and a lot of times with OER, we tend to think small because OER can have a very big impact at a very small level. But we need to be able to talk about it at a much more systemic, larger level and be able to articulate why it's part of a bigger picture that's solving the problems in education. So taking the time to actually define that and be able to articulate why OER is a solution to those problems and how you envision it advancing solutions in your state. And when you're defining the problem and solution, it's really important to think about how to define them in a way that most people are going to agree with. So in advocacy, you're usually involved in advocating for something not everybody agrees with, but you do want to be able to define the problem and its solution in a way that will, most people will resonate with. And you don't want them disagreeing on those facts. And make it relevant to right now. So we're not going to spend time on this today, but I did want to talk about it because I think just like adding that mindset to any planning that you're doing, making sure you're starting with problem and solution before you get into your goals. So now let's talk about goals. So what is an advocacy goal? An advocacy goal is a specific change you want to make that advances a solution to the problem that you're trying to solve. So a goal isn't solving the whole problem. It's a specific thing you can change that's going to get you closer to that solution that you're envisioning. Can't be something that you have the power to do yourself, because that can be a goal, but that's not an advocacy goal. It's just something you can do. And it's totally fine to have goals that are not advocacy goals, but we're talking about advocacy goals here. And then I think you've probably heard of the SMART goal framework. And I think it is hokey as it is. I think it actually is a really useful way to look at your goals, to understand, is this a good goal that I can plan around? And the SMART acronym stands for specific. Is it identifying a specific change in a specific context? Is it measurable? So can I tell whether I have achieved it or not, and to what extent? Is it achievable? Is it something that can actually be done within the realm of possibility, or is it too aspirational? Is it relevant? So relevant meaning relevant to the solution and the problem that you've defined. So there are lots of good things that you could work toward, but is it relevant to the problem you're seeking to solve? And time bound, meaning, in order to develop a plan to achieve something, you need to be doing that on a specific timeline, and your goal needs to, allow you to achieve something on a specific timeline. Okay, so I'm going to show you some goal statements, and you're going to tell me whether they pass the SMART test. And I'm really hoping the animations on these slides are going to work. Nope, they didn't. Okay, so you have the answer that this does not pass the SMART test. But can you tell me why? Why do you think that, which SMART piece does this violate?
It's not measurable.
It's not measurable.
Yeah.
No, it's not time.
It's pretty bad. It's an advocacy goal.
Not time.
All right. Increase OER adoption. It's a good goal.
Not time bound.
It's not time bound.
It's too short. We just need to add more to it. To make
Yep.
it smart.
You could make this a SMART goal. How could you make it a SMART goal?
By X% by this date.
Yep. And in this department kind of thing. Okay. How about this one?
Closure, but now it's just.
So I actually would say this isn't achievable. And I'm a cynic. In an advocacy context, this isn't really an achievable goal. This is an aspirational goal. This is a solution. This is part of your solution. This is the vision that we have for the world and the thing that we're continuously working toward. But it's not an achievable goal in an advocacy context. You could change this so you're talking about a specific percentage of students that you think is achievable, or a specific population of students. That worked. Okay, how about this?
I mean, it could be. We're doing it.
So I would argue this is not relevant. And it's not relevant because it's not directly getting to the solution to the problem. It's a step on the way there. You know, convening your OER advocates, getting people excited, training them could be a step in that process, but this is not an advocacy goal. I would also argue that this is something you can do yourself without needing to advocate for, right? Unless you change this goal to be convince MEC to organize a regional convening. In which case it could be an advocacy goal. All right. Can you tell me why this is good? So, and I think the time-bound piece of this is sort of implicit. So it's specific. It's measurable. You can tell whether you've done it or not. It's probably achievable, or let's assume it's achievable. It's relevant because it's going to directly get to those, you know, supporting faculty to create and adopt OER, presumably. And how about this one? Is this an advocacy goal? So,
I think it's.
yes, it is. Why?
It's specific.
Yep, exactly.
Can you repeat what she said, or they said, whoever?
That you have to get somebody else to do something to achieve this. So this is tricky because this isn't changing something, it's stopping a change from happening. But that is effectively changing things. So it's an advocacy goal in that respect, and it does pass the SMART test. All right, so we are going to break for a few minutes. And what I'd like all of you to do within your state group is go back to the goals that you wrote out yesterday in the worksheet, and hopefully you have access to those things. I did not verify that everybody did. Okay, so please go back through those and look at those goals and see if you can identify at least one advocacy goal in there. And if you don't, that's okay, because we're going to have time later to try to identify one. But please take a look and be ready to report to the group an advocacy goal from your list. Who has a goal? Nobody has a goal. You failed the test. Okay, this table, what's your advocacy goal?
Our advocacy goal is to add $20,000 to the university's budget, or increase our shared services.
Okay,
Shared
so
services.
money. I can repeat if that's helpful. Okay, so adding a specific amount of money to a specific program. Fantastic. Kansas?
By September 2025, we will explore a K-12 OER initiative, including a liaison with KSDE. That was loud really fast.
What was the verb? Explore?
Yeah,
Who is exploring?
the Kansas steering committee. OER
Okay,
steering committee.
is that something you can do yourselves?
Say that again?
Can you rephrase the goal in a way that you're convincing somebody else to do something?
Yep.
Something to think about. All
Fun.
right, other people. Illinois, what's your
I don't wanna
goal?
So we're Illinois.
Oh, sorry. Hi,
Yeah.
I did. Illinois, what's your goal?
Convince the policy committee to OER.
Great.
It's like you're trying to pick a
Okay.
side, but don't have a microphone.
Sorry.
again, Dan.
Convince a committee to do a thing.
Yeah.
That's an advocacy goal. Great job. Cool. One more. Michigan? Yes.
So within the next year, convince Mike, which is a new to establish an OER liaison for higher education to advance OER as an educational priority.
Fantastic. So convince a committee to do a thing.
Yes.
Great. Love it. Excellent. Good job, everyone. All right.
You gotta.
Before we get back into talking about the advocacy framework and the rest of that, I did want to just like pause for a minute because there was a question about Barnes and Noble and equitable access. And I wanted to do some quick terminology just to make sure everybody is on the same page about that, because I think, you know, some of you are going to think about advocacy in the context of inclusive access and how this model is impacting your work in your state. And at dinner last night, I can't remember who it was, somebody mentioned, like, I always think of the slide that you have about differentiating the different inclusive access models and stuff. So I figured I'd just like quickly do some terminology in case it's helpful. So when we're talking about the inclusive access model or the equitable access model, what we're talking about is a textbook sales model where digital course content is included in students' tuition and fees. This is different than open educational resources because we're talking about traditional educational materials that are delivered in a digital format, and students are billed for it unless they opt out. Access typically expires. It's traditional materials that are all rights reserved. Faculty can adapt them compared to OER, where you can do all of those things. Access is free forever. Students can keep them, and you can adapt them. And then there are two kinds of inclusive access programs that you're going to run into on your campus. And it's really important to be able to distinguish between these two. So the first is a course by course program, which most campuses that do inclusive access have. And that is where specific courses have chosen to be part of inclusive access. And students are billed the actual cost of the materials in their course unless they opt out. And faculty can decide whether their course is in it or not. And faculty who are using OER are not going to have their students billed for stuff that they don't need to pay for. The equitable access model, and I put that in quotes because I don't think we should actually use this term. I prefer the term flat fee inclusive access as a more specific and descriptive way to talk about this. It is where the entire campus or all of the undergraduate courses are forced sort of into this model. And students are automatically billed a flat cost per credit hour for access to all of their required materials for all of their courses, unless they opt out of all of it, and it's either in or out. And these are typically outsourced to a bookstore to operate, usually Barnes & Noble or Follett. That's, well, how you'll hear about it. Follett's program is called Follett Access. Barnes & Noble is called First Day Complete. If you are on a campus or in a state where you have Barnes & Noble or Follett operated bookstores, assume that your administrations are being pitched on moving to this model. So this model is very problematic for OER in the sense that it means that courses that use OER are getting charged that same flat fee as every other course. So students are not receiving the benefits of the cost savings that the OER adoption achieves. Of course, there are other benefits to OER, but it's a problem because it cannibalizes the progress that we've made in reducing costs, and it de-incentivizes faculty to be sensitive to cost. And, you know, we're all human. And I've already heard on campuses that have gone toward this model that they're starting to see backsliding because, you know, if you're not charging your students more by choosing that super expensive, you know, Pearson textbook or whatever, it's a lot, you know, easier to say yes to that. So with equitable access programs or quote equitable access programs, I encourage you to think about how can you exempt OER courses from this. So fight this if you can, and if you can't, exempt your OER courses from being charged that fee. If you have course marking, that will make that a lot easier. Okay, that ends our interlude, and we're going to get back into talking about advocacy. Okay, so we talked about problem and solution. We talked about how to set advocacy goals. And now we're going to talk about strategy and tactics. And you hear this word strategy thrown around a lot, like being strategic and coming up with strategies. And we're going to talk about it in meaning something very specific in an advocacy context. So strategy at its core is your theory of change. It's your theory about how your actions are going to lead to your goal. So how does, to develop a strategy, you start by thinking about how does the change that you identified in your goal get made? What is the process for that? Who decides that? Where is the power? And then who are the key people in that process? Who are the decision makers? Who are the people that have power? And then who or what could influence those people to make the change that you want to make? And what is in it for them? How do you talk about your issue in a way that will resonate with them? Why would they care about making your change? Chances are it's not going to be for the same reasons that you care about it. So putting yourself in your head. And when we're developing strategies, there's sort of different levels of, I guess, influence that you can exert. And this is one way to visualize that. So with strategies to wield influence, you can adopt any level of theory of change. So you can create a climate where your decision maker is likely to do something by, writing an article or publishing some research, getting some data, and then putting that out in the world and then hoping that they'll make the decision. And that's not an advocacy strategy. It's a strategy, but it's not an advocacy strategy because you're not directly trying to influence. Where I think the advocacy sweet spot is like in this persuade, incentivize, and then carefully pressure territory. So the sort of lowest level influence you can provide is to try to persuade somebody. So to develop arguments, find messengers to go to that person and try to make the case. Unfortunately, in this world, the most compelling arguments are not enough to solve our problems. So this isn't always enough, but it's always thinking about, is this possible? So the next step is incentivizing. So can you provide funding? Can you provide accolades? Can you show support? Can you help get them something that they want? Can you connect this to their goals, strategic plan, however they're evaluated? Can you create an incentive for the person to want to do this? And then pressure, I think we want to use this one carefully because it can burn bridges if you apply too much. But think about, can you generate pressure that will push somebody to do that? So an example of this is, can you get students to write in and complain? Or can you demonstrate that there's faculty pushback against this idea? Or can you get the chair of the higher ed committee to make a call to, the administrator that's about to sign the contract for equitable access and ask a bunch of questions about whether this is a good idea or not. So thinking about these verbs as types of strategies that you can use. Can you convince them? Can you incentivize them? And can you appropriately pressure them? And then I think where we want to be really careful is about straying into that punish, admonish, like drag through the mud, which can feel tempting sometimes. But it's usually, it's not something we consider in advocacy because what it does is burn bridges. And once you've sort of gone that direction, there's no reason the person is going to want to make the change that you want to make if you've already sort of admonished or punished them for not doing it. So don't go into that territory. Always create what I like to call a championship opportunity. Set the decision makers up to look like champions and be successful. All right. So in developing strategies, it's important to get sort of the lay of the land and understand who are the different parties that are involved in the goal that you're trying to achieve. Who is affected by the change that you are seeking to make? And we sometimes use the word stakeholders for this because of the colonial origins of that. I'm using affected parties here. I'll just give it to you. These are some of the affected parties by a lot of common changes that we advocate for in OER. So, it's the students, faculty, librarians, also thinking about like the publishers, bookstores, and vendors. And then, outside your campus community, the employers and your communities, your parents, and the different roles within the university. So some of these are going to be the same for most things. Some of them are going to vary depending on what context you're in. Your board of governors may be on here, your committee may be on here. And it's always good to sort of write out a list of all of these possible things. And then the next step is to think about who are my allies and who are my opposition. So who wants this change, or who can I convince to want this change? And who is likely to oppose this change? So who do we think, for a general OER related goal, so like establishing an OER grant program, who do we think are our allies? So that's likely to be students, right? Who else?
Librarians.
Librarians.
Instructional designers.
Yep. Who? Some faculty. Who are our opposition?
Bookstores, publishers,
Mm-hmm.
vendors.
Yep. Yeah, we had pretty much the same list. Yeah, I think the bookstore can depend on your campus, but if, increasingly, yep. Okay, so that's the first test. So think about who are your allies and who are your opposition. And then the next one is to think about decision makers and influencers. So with the change that you're trying to make, who is making that decision? Who has the power to decide that? And then who can influence that person? So for example, if your decision makers, administrators, and I realize the contrast here isn't great, so sorry about that. But if your decision makers, administrators, the people that can influence administrators are, often like students and faculty can, parents can, if you can mobilize them, the bookstore, publishers, vendors can, policymakers can. Some of these others might, but for example, this might be it. And then you go back and look at who your allies are. So which of your allies are influential? And that can help guide you toward a strategy and the kind of actions that you can take to advance your goal. So what do you have on your side that you can deploy in service of getting what you want? Okay, the last piece of the framework is tactics. So we've gone through problem, solution, goal, meaning the change you want to make, the strategy, which is your theory of how you're going to influence that change to happen. And your tactics are the actual actions that you're going to take to advance that. So thinking about, who among your allies and resources are going to be influential, what specific actions can you take with them, and put, whatever resources you have to best use. And if you don't have what you need, who can you recruit? And let's see. All right. So I'm going to give you an example of what this might look like. All right, so our problem is that textbooks are expensive, et cetera. The solution is that we want to expand the effective use of OER to benefit students. And this would be longer and more complex, but basically. So our goal is to establish a statewide OER grant program. Our strategy committee might be something like convincing the coordinating board that it would generate a return on investment for students, possibly tying that to a strategic plan. An example of a tactic is something like gathering savings data from faculty in order to demonstrate the ROI. You see the difference between those things? And a common question we get is like, how do you tell the difference between a strategy and a tactic, or a strategy and the goal? Because they can sound the same. And you can have tactics that are advocacy goals in themselves. So what I like to do is use the in order to test. So if we start with the tactic and say gather savings data from faculty, in order to what? Well, in order to convince the coordinating board of the return on investment. In order to what? Establish a statewide OER grant program. In order to what? Benefit students. And when you get to benefit students, the thing before it was a goal. Well, and I guess in order to solve the problem that textbooks are expensive. So use the in order to test. All right, a few examples before we break out. All right, what do you think this is? A goal, a strategy, or a tactic? And I'm really, it appears that the animations are going to work on this one. That's good. What do we think this is? Goal, strategy, or tactic? And you can make the case for any of them. Yeah, I think this is a goal. It's specific, it's smart, and it pretty directly gets you to benefiting students. All right, well, okay, there you go. All right, I'm gonna read these out in case it doesn't work. So why is this a strategy?
You're having someone else carry your message, someone that's more influential.
Yeah. You're wielding influence. You're trying to, either persuade or pressure. You're mobilizing your allies to persuade or pressure a decision maker. So that's a strategy. All right, get the student senate to pass a resolution opposing an equitable access flat fee. Tactic. Persuade the higher ed committee chair to support funding for OER grants.
Strategy.
You guys are killing it. So that is a strategy. And that is a strategy because it's not passing a bill. The goal is to pass a bill. And your strategy to pass the bill is to persuade the Senate committee chair to support it. And your tactic might be something like having students write in letters to the Senate committee chair telling them that OER is important. All right, conduct a student survey to gather information on the impact of textbook costs. Yeah, I would say that's a tactic in most cases. Depending on who has the power to do the survey, though, it could be a goal. Or like it could become an advocacy goal because, the thing with advocacy is depending on like what your level of influence is and what your sphere of influence is, getting your campus to do a survey may actually be a whole advocacy campaign in itself. And I think it's important to remember that with advocacy, goals can exist on many levels, and you can make progress with advocacy at from wherever you are, whether that's, an individual within a library, within an institution, or, somebody who has power within the statewide coordinating board. Just the things you're going to do are a little bit different. And then I think this is the last one. Establish a statewide OER council. So that's a goal, but it could also be a strategy. No, it could be a tactic for sure in service of a larger goal. So all of this is to say, these things can exist on multiple levels. And did anybody take our advocacy pilot course over the summer here? I don't think anybody did, yeah. But this meme featured prominently in that because I think there's like a tendency in higher ed, anytime you have a framework, it's like, but is it a strategy or a goal? And did I write this the right way? And there's no room for advocacy or that in advocacy. It's doing the best you can and sort of going with your instincts about how to apply this framework in a way that advances your thinking. So don't worry too much about, whether it's perfect or whether you've identified the correct level of the framework because it can be applied at all different levels. So remember our friend Doge and the infinite repeating loop. Okay. We're going to break out and do a worksheet, and I have a QR code for that worksheet, which maybe I'll just put up here now. But I do want to pause before we go out to that to see if there are any questions. How much time do we have? Okay. What do you think the chances are that I shared the document so you can access it?
We'll find out in a minute.
Good, the chances are good.
Okay.
You guys are gonna do it.
All right. So no questions? Excellent. All right. The worksheet, you're going to start with an advocacy goal. Think about who are the decision makers? What's the process? Brainstorm why that person would care about the change. What is in it for them? How can you make them care? And then brainstorm how you could influence the person.
So.
Yep. Nah. Okay, and we're gonna do like 15 minutes? All right, so thanks everybody for engaging in that exercise. Any questions that came up in your groups or specific observations about how this work that you'd like to share with the group? Jenny?
Well, I mean, I've only been able to touch base with a few of you, but I've.
Use the microphone.
I've only been able to touch base with a few of the tables, but a common thing came up at both places, is that there's a person they need to have in the conversation who is either has had to catch a flight or just hasn't been a part of this meeting. And so I think this goes back to what you were saying, is who are your allies, who are your collaborators, your supporters, your influencers, because in two cases we had that crop up as, well, we think we'd like to do this, but we're just not sure how to put some of the details in because we rely on another person to provide that information.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important piece of the
Yep.
coalition building and figuring things out.
For sure. Yeah, and a big part of advocacy is gathering information because you don't always know. You know, the biggest question is like, who has the power to change this? Who decides? And sometimes that's the question. And being able to gather the information you need to be able to make an informed strategy is important. You know, I've had to guess a lot in my career, especially in politics and working within, you know, large agencies like the Department of Education, where you have no idea who's in charge of making what decision. And sometimes it's like a random person in a different office and you don't even realize that. So information gathering is so important, and being able to bring in people from many perspectives is important. So, and I heard that the need to gather information come up a lot too. So don't worry if you didn't know all of the answers today. Get the information you need, but don't let it hold you back from picking the best strategy you can.
I had another thing that has come up in the past and is coming up today too. If one of the things you need to do is collect data via a survey instrument or something, human subjects, when do you need to do it? How do you get around it if you can? What are some strategies? And I didn't know if that had come up at other tables and if you have some recommendations.
Start early.
Well, yeah, start.
I actually have I have a response to that
Yeah,
from an
great.
advocacy perspective that may or may not be helpful at all. But in order to inform your advocacy strategy, you do not need rigorous research. You need intelligence. And there's a difference. Intelligence in the sense that you need intel. And don't let instincts to try to come up with the perfect methodology, a scientifically sound data pool, slow you down from getting the sort of quick and dirty information you need to make informed decisions that inform your strategy. So that doesn't help with human subjects, but maybe ask the question, does this have to be a formal survey? Or can I get the information in a different way? So you were first.
Yeah.
I'm on the IRB board at my university. So if you are just doing a survey to inform your own program, then you don't need IRB approval. If you're doing it for publishing purposes, then you do. So, but if it's something simple like a survey, then you'll probably get fast tracked. But yeah, that's it.
Brad?
Yeah, if I could add, we did a survey a couple years ago, and for at least in our IRB, there's an IRB exempt category. So we still basically submitted to the IRB, but we were able to do it in a very fast-tracked exempt way because we weren't collecting any sensitive data. We weren't asking any questions that would be like triggering or traumatic for students. And so like we were able to be in the exempt category, and that sort of covered us in case we ever wanted to publish. So it may be that like you don't have to go through the full IRB, and it won't really be too crazy to just submit it as a, you know, sort of a really basic exempt survey, and then you're covered if you decide to publish later.
Thank you.
So we have 2 minutes left, which is an awkward amount of time. I would like to use this opportunity. Well, we were going to go around, but I think there's plenty of opportunity to share a little bit more about your goals and strategies as you go back. Things I encourage you to think about is, with your goals, make sure that you're asking, is this something that we can do ourselves? Or is this somebody else has the power to control that we need to influence? Advocacy is most useful in the system that we talked about, is most useful in situations where somebody has the power to allow the thing and you need to convince them to do it. Somebody with more power than you. And the other thing that I wanted to just reference, and I am failing at this computer, so I'm not sure if this is going to help us. Oh boy. Okay. I don't know. I don't speak Windows. Oh, there we go. All right, cool. I don't know if this link is going to work, but I heard a number of people talk about how to talk to state legislators and how to, get state policy. There's a resource on the SPARC website called the OER State Policy Playbook that can be a useful thing to send to legislators that provides some model language and some sample information about types of legislation that you could pursue. And a couple of things to think about with policy. Policy is a tool, not a goal. So make sure that if you're seeking to pursue policy, it is for a purpose, that you are, trying to get money, or you're trying to get your institution to do course marking because you failed to get them to do it on their own, or you're trying to get a statewide OER council established because you failed to do that through other means. Legislation can be very powerful, but remember that our opposition has the ability to influence legislators too. So if you are going to pursue legislation, make sure that there's a plan to keep your sponsors on side. And I do welcome you to let SPARC know, because we do provide support to states. We can't lobby in every state, but we can provide strategic support on state legislation if you are pursuing that and actively talking to legislators. So did this link work?
No.
Okay.
But
Well,
if you Google it, it's the first result.
yeah, Google SPARC State Policy Playbook and you'll get there. Okay, so that we are at time. Thanks so much for participating. I know this is tough in the morning.